Welcome back to the second half of Unit 1 on Reconstruction. We ended our last lecture with the Reconstruction Amendments, which were designed by Congress to implement safeguards for Black rights in the face of many of President Johnson's vetoes. And we saw that the amendments, while controversial and interpreted very narrowly at times, represented the goals of Northern Republicans to do away with slavery and extend civil rights to Black men. Where we're going to pick up with that theme today are the overlaps between the abolitionist movement and the women's movement. Then I want to explore some of the successes and failures of the radical Republicans in Congress and talk about the response from the South. There was what's known as a Southern resistance from the Southern Redeemers, as they were called, and they would mock Northerners and Republicans as either scalawags or carpetbaggers. So we'll talk a little bit about those terms and the founding of the Ku Klux Klan, or KKK. Then we will come back to presidential politics and talk about Johnson's impeachment and the trial. And we'll end by introducing this idea of American expansion and specifically talk about Alaska. This will be a theme that we'll pick up more in Unit 2 with the Gilded Age, but I want to introduce it here because some of the key players are going to be recognizable to you in this unit. While abolitionists counted many prominent women among their ranks and celebrated the legislation that was passed during Reconstruction as triumphs for their movements, those who supported these same rights were getting a little bit frustrated that they did not include women. Frederick Douglass, who was a famous abolitionist, statesman, and orator, supported women's rights and attended the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. However, when the 15th Amendment was proposed, he favored it because he believed that it was important for Black men to receive the right to vote, even if that didn't include women at the time. If you remember, the wording stated that denying the vote was prohibited on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The word that was missing here for many of the advocates was sex. Those who fought for universal suffrage, meaning that everyone could vote, argued that the 15th Amendment split the Black and women's issues. Douglass noted that this was, in fact, the Negro hour, that it was more pressing in his mind for Black men to receive the vote first and that women would come next. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were two leading advocates for women's rights. Stanton was furious about the wording of the 15th Amendment and reacted by using racial slurs to denigrate ignorant men who received the right to vote while the most intelligent women were denied. Though this is just a side note, many years later in 1884, Stanton would put her working differences aside when she defended Douglass's marriage to a white woman that you can see pictured here, Helen Pitts with her sister. And Stanton said of their marriage, "In defense of the right to marry whom we please, we might quote some of the basic principles of our government and suggest that in some things individual rights to taste should control." Some of their own family members of Douglass's and Pitt's were less supportive, as were Black newspapers, which claimed incorrectly that their union was illegal or criticized Douglass for betraying his, quote, Black blood. Racial divides within the women's movement forced many people to question if supporting Gaines as abolitionists made them betrayers of women. Sojourner Truth argued that, quote, "If colored men get their rights and not colored women, you see the colored men will be masters over the women, and it will be just as bad as it was before." While some women lamented the missed opportunity, a majority accepted the reality of Black suffrage and formed the American Woman Suffrage Organization in 1869. The rest remained with the Stanton's National Woman Suffrage Association. The Anthony Stanton wing of the movement only accepted women as members and focused all of the efforts on pressuring Congress to put forward another amendment that addressed women's suffrage. Stanton claimed that a woman must not put trust in a man when it came to achieving these goals. Stanton was motivated by abolitionist and women's rights advocate Lydia Maria Child, who once wrote to a Republican congressman, quote, "If I were to give vent to all of my pent-up wrath concerning the subordination of women, I might frighten you. Suffice it, therefore, to say, either the theory of our government is false, or women have a right to vote." The fractured women's movement would remain separate entities, often at odds with one another, until they reunited in the 1890s. Feminists in this period were also calling for additional changes. Some wanted to liberalize divorce laws so that it would be easier for a woman to separate legally from her husband. It was only possible for women to divorce their husbands if they had proof of extreme abuse, adultery, or desertion. They also wanted to access what we would call birth control today. The Civil War created opportunities for sexual promiscuity and sexually transmitted diseases spread through the armies. The US Surgeon General estimated that there were over 180,000 cases of venereal disease in the Union Army. One officer wrote home to his wife and lamented that, quote, "You would think that there was not a married man in the regiment." For a lot of young soldiers, the war thrusted them into a space that allowed them to get out from the watchful eyes of their local communities, churches, and family members. They had access to things like alcohol and prostitution, which often led to troubling consequences. When soldiers could order contraception or erotic materials through the mail during the war, diseases continued to spread despite the fact that they had such access among all classes and ranks. Union doctors estimated that Black soldiers were far less likely to get sexually transmitted diseases than their white counterparts, and they noted a correlation in the decreased amount of alcohol consumption by the Black demographic. Therefore, women were responding to these issues and took them up as part of the feminist movement. While women did not get the right to vote nationally during Reconstruction, those living in the Wyoming Territory did. This was a program put in place in 1869 to try to attract women to settle there. Some estimates suggest that men outnumbered women 5-1 in this area. It would be another 32 years before the territory entered the Union as a state, and women did not get the right to vote in the United States until 1920, and we'll be talking about that later in the course. Radical Republicans in Congress were not very interested in the plight of women, and as we saw in our previous lecture, invested most of their efforts into helping African Americans rise both politically and economically. While they had a mixed legacy of successes and failures, as seen through programs like education or land redistribution, they nevertheless believed that it was possible to transform the Southern economy. It seemed possible to them to invest heavily in railroads as a means of making the South into bustling hives of business centers. The problem was that they couldn't use the models that worked in the North and expect them to fit the circumstances in the South. Ultimately, people didn't end up investing much in the South and preferred to turn their attention to more lucrative opportunities in the West. This left the majority of African Americans in poverty. While we have seen the achievements of Republican government in terms of educational opportunities created during Reconstruction as Black schools and colleges were established. They also made headway when it came to civil rights legislation. Therefore, while Reconstruction is usually viewed in light of its failures, radical Republicans were not entirely unsuccessful in their endeavors. They did make strides when it came to schooling and community construction projects. Despite some setbacks, they worked tirelessly to revise those Black codes, which had included racist restrictions and language. This political cartoon by Thomas Nast, and you'll be seeing another one here in this presentation. Thomas Nast was actually a very famous cartoonist who is credited with creating the image of not only Santa Claus in the United States, but also the Republican elephant for the GOP. And so in this political cartoon, Nast titled it "Patience on a Monument." It depicts the indignities suffered by African Americans that Republican Reconstruction policies were trying to rectify. The makeup of some of these Republican state governments could be quite diverse, and this contributed to a great deal of mocking from the other side of the aisle. We noted in our last lecture that several African Americans served in political office during Reconstruction, while Blacks served in every state legislature and even made up the majority of both houses in South Carolina for a brief period. This wasn't necessarily the norm. Most of the top positions in state government went to white Republicans. Their Southern Democrat opponents referred to them with scorn as either scalawags or carpetbaggers. The term scalawag originated among the Scots-Irish. It literally meant a runty, worthless animal. So a scalawag was a white Republican from the South. For former Confederates, these were the worst type because they argued that not only were scalawags disloyal to their race, but they were also disloyal to the South in general, disloyal to the region. Carpetbaggers originated as a means to describe Northerners who flocked to the South after the war. It implied that these Republicans shoved all of their goods into cheap suitcases that were known as carpetbags, and you can see that depicted here in this cartoon, and eagerly set their sights on the personal benefits they stood to gain by seeking office in the South. This image isn't really the means of describing reality, though, because most Northerners had either been Union soldiers who were just seeking out economic opportunities based on what they had seen during their time in the war. They're not political actors by any means, or they were teachers, religious leaders, or social workers who desired to come to the South in order to better assist former slaves. Nevertheless, these individuals, while they might not have been seeking political office, they did have a profound impact on the election. Before their arrival, the split between Blacks who voted Republican and whites who voted Democratic was pretty even. These votes would tip the scales in key races. Many Southerners did not react kindly to these efforts to rehabilitate and alter their ways of life. Democrats in the South, along with the planters and business leaders who supported them, objected to all kinds of changes that were designed to protect Black suffrage and civil rights. Nothing that the radical Republicans could have done would have changed their minds about what many Democrats viewed as an abomination and an example of what they referred to as Black supremacy. They charged these governments with corruption, and while there was a lot of that happening during this period, it was not a platform issue. It was not something that was relegated to just one party or one race in the country. In response, these opponents to Reconstruction led a counter-revolution that was designed to redeem the South and reclaim it for the Democratic Party. This would set in motion the undoing of Reconstruction as Democrats and white supremacists in the South launched a campaign to overthrow the gains made for Blacks. While not entirely a regional movement of resistance from the South, it's important to note that Reconstruction stood on shaky ground because of an unwillingness among individuals in the North to really do anything about it. This is another well-known cartoon by Nast, and it depicts two white men threatening a very uneasy African American holding a voting ticket. So it's being presented to you from the radical Republican perspective. And the caption reads, "Of course he wants to vote the Democratic ticket." The second line says, "Democratic reformer, you're as free as air, aren't you? Say you are, or I'll blow your black head off." And so what that image is depicting is the belief, especially among radical Republicans in the North, that the Democratic Party was using violence in order to shape their own state governments. And the thing that Democrats in the South had behind them, which will ultimately shift the political makeup of that region, was precisely violence. People were openly challenging Republican rule through a reign of terror. As we have seen, violence against Blacks did not cease with the end of the war or the legislation that was put in place to protect their rights. They were attacked or killed for things like using language that whites found offensive or not moving out of the way when passing them on the sidewalk. While this violence started off as unorganized and in response to individual situations, it gradually expanded as secret societies gained strength and sought out additional membership so that they could intimidate Black voters and kill political officials or teachers. Undoubtedly, the most recognizable of these organizations was the Ku Klux Klan, or KKK, which was founded in 1866 in Tennessee by Nathan Bedford Forrest, a general in the former Confederacy. Its name derived from a Greek word meaning circle. It started off as a social organization for men to gather and form a sense of bonding through a use of costumes and secret rituals. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, the early KKK was really all about causing mischief and pranking people. So for example, the SPL Center explained, quote, "At first, a favorite Klan tactic had been for white-sheeted Klansmen wearing a ghoulish mask to ride up to a Black family's home at night and demand water. When the well bucket was offered, the Klansmen would gulp it down and demand more, having actually poured the water through a rubber tube that flowed into a leather bottle concealed beneath his robe. After draining several buckets, the rider would exclaim that he had not had a drink since he died on the battlefield at Shiloh. Then he galloped into the night, leaving the impression that ghosts of the Confederate dead were riding in the countryside." The Klan quickly transitioned to something far more sinister than a fraternal organization that was all about pranks. Make no mistake about this, the Klan was a terrorist organization that perpetuated criminal acts against American citizens. By the 1870s, it spread all over the South and propelled Democrats to power. Klansmen were successful at intimidating and crushing the morale of Southern Republicans, and the North looked on this violence with greater apathy towards how they were to reintegrate the South in the first place. It was not just the racial violence in the South that led them to become less enthusiastic about civil rights for Blacks. They had become consumed and overwhelmed by other things, which we'll be discussing at the end of the next unit, including Western expansion, economic opportunities, and growing political controversies. Nevertheless, the violence did not necessarily go unchecked. The federal government stepped in to order the situation in which 3 enforcement or force acts between 1870 and 1871. These laws made efforts to deprive U.S. citizens of their civil and political rights a federal offense rather than a state violation. Federal officials began prosecuting Klansmen, and this was a difficult endeavor as many faced all-white juries. But these efforts managed to put the Klan out of existence by 1872. This marked the end of the first phase of the Klan, but as we shall see, the organization was revived in the 1920s and again in the 1950s and 1960s. White supremacists turned their attention to more subtle means of intimidation, like those literacy tests and other forms of voter suppression. As Republican governments attempted to address the Redeemers and the Klan in the South in the 1860s, Republicans in Congress honed in on the growing divides between their visions and President Johnson's actions. Congress had been busy taking the lead in Reconstruction after the failure of presidential Reconstruction. They were at odds with the president over whether he had the power to remove officials from office that the Senate had already confirmed. In 1867, they solidified congressional power with what was known as the Tenure of Office Act, which required the Senate to approve any appointment changes. These were major alterations in terms of the structure of the presidency and reflected Congress's efforts to reconstruct the South more broadly. What President Johnson decided to do in response was to wait until Congress had adjourned. And once that happened, he decided to suspend the Secretary of War in 1867, Edwin Stanton, who was seen as someone who stood in the president's way as he was working to undermine congressional reconstruction. A few months later, he formally dismissed Stanton, and this set off a chain of events whereby the House met and issued articles of impeachment for the first time against a sitting president. They overwhelmingly voted to impeach Johnson for high crimes and misdemeanors, including 11 counts of presidential misconduct, 9 of which were directly related to that Tenure of Office Act. While it was evident that the radical Republicans in the House disliked Johnson and his antics, calling him things like a drunken tailor and accusing him of improper relationships with women, the Senate was responsible for holding the actual trial. And this trial lasted for about 11 weeks. Moderate Republicans in the House broke rank and voted for acquittal, resulting in the impeachment conviction falling short by just 1 vote. Many questioned if the Tenure of Office Act was even constitutional to begin with. Therefore, Johnson was found not guilty. This was a complicated constitutional issue, as their fears of destabilizing the presidency meant that future cases to remove a president from office would be much more challenging. This was a questionable move for radical Republicans who had to negotiate with Johnson after the impeachment trial to ensure that he would not further obstruct their ongoing efforts. And in our next unit, we'll be talking about how this impeachment process helped to propel Ulysses S. Grant to popularity as he won the party nomination in 1868. And what you're looking at here on your screen is a cartoon of President Johnson, who is reaching for a copy of the Constitution of the United States, and you can see that it completely flattens him. And so this was a common theme and visual during his impeachment trial. One of the many distractions, right, that will ultimately take away attention from other efforts to protect civil rights during Reconstruction was westward expansion. And we'll follow up with this theme, like I said, when we get to the Gilded Age, but it begins with Johnson's administration. International relations are at play here because Russia was still recovering from its loss to Britain in the Crimean War in the 1850s and was seeking to prevent Britain from making any further gains in neighboring territories. So the Russian presence in Alaska had been relatively minimal since the early 1700s, but they increasingly saw it as a risky investment because if war were to break out with Britain again, it would have been very unlikely that Russia would have been able to hold on to it. So they wanted some kind of profit from this territory that they had. It was a vast territory. So they reached out to American politicians and said, hey, does anybody really want to buy this? And they found their man in the Secretary of State, William Seward. And Seward was an expansionist. And what that meant was he believed it was the duty of the United States to acquire more territory. He thought this was inevitable. He thought it was justifiable. And these folks bought into the idea of manifest destiny, which meant they thought God intended the U.S. to govern North America because the American people were special and that they had the power to transform the West. After negotiating the treaty, it passed by a wide margin in the Senate, and this is significant because, as you have just seen in the impeachment trial, Congress and President Johnson were not always seeing eye to eye on most political issues. But it's also important to note here that not everyone in the U.S. was as eager as members of Congress to take over this territory. Anti-expansionists argued that it was against the values of a Republican government, lowercase Republican government here, as in governing a republic, to add territory when they did not have the consent of the people that inhabited that area. This purchase was mocked by some who thought that Alaska was this chilly, barren wasteland that was just not going to bring about much good for the nation. And so they often referred to the $7.2 million purchase as Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox. At the time, this worked out to be about 2 cents per acre. If you were to make that purchase today, the equivalent price in terms of today's money would be about 132 million at 37 cents per acre. So for those of you who grew up in the Central Valley and know the cost of land these days, that'll give you a better perspective here. Those who supported this deal understood its risks, but argued that Alaska had the potential to be very rich in gold, furs, and other resources that would fuel America's growing industries. So for those of you who watch Gold Rush, you'll know what I'm talking about. They also wanted to show their support to Russians who had backed the North during the US Civil War. Now, we're going to turn to the importance of expansion and industrialization in our coming lectures, but I want to conclude as to what we've discovered so far in this unit, and that was that Reconstruction was an incredibly divisive undertaking. The South was unwilling to let go of many of its racial, social, economic, and political systems. The Republican Party and Northerners also struggled to plan in the first place for how that process was supposed to take place at the end of the war, who was responsible for that, and moderates in government didn't always recognize the strength of racism in their efforts to try to preserve things that they thought were more important, like property rights and the interests of state governments over the civil rights of Blacks. So we'll pick up more with that in our unit for next week.